Hi, this is Curt and welcome to another edition of Fire Law Roundup.
So the case I find most interesting, I'll explain to people.
Wait a minute. You found cases more interesting than these two?
Yeah.
Oh.
Yes. Only because I just had this issue the other day where I just got a settlement for a woman, and she her college actually paid her for violating some of her rights. And she calls me and says, "Hey, is this taxable? This money taxable?" And so she got money for—
Is she one of our readers?
Yeah, she will be. So she got money for in her case, right, which is not the case we're going to discuss, but you'll see, everyone will see why it's relevant. She got money for mental embarrassment, and then she had to go to therapy because of what happened, right? So mental anguish. So she calls me, says, "This is taxable." I said, "I don't give tax advice. Talk to your accountant." Right? Not an accountant. But so I said, "But it may be. I just, I can't tell you." I said, "But it's not wages," I said to her, "because you're not employed by them. But on the other hand, it is a personal injury." I said, "But it's mental, not physical. Are there, we talked about, are there physical manifestations, etc." In any event, here's what happens. This is generally binding because it's the U.S. tax court. This is important to everybody who receives money from a lawsuit. You want to know, is the money they pay me taxable? And look, if somebody receives money for, and Curt, you've frozen. If somebody receives money for wages, then the wages, right, if back wages, etc., then that's taxable. It's just taxable because it's back wages. You're back. So if, however, the question here is, they enter into an agreement, a settlement agreement, which is, lawyers should understand that these agreements, as people will now see, are very influential. The settlement agreements, what they're being paid money for and what they sought, right? What did you ask for in your lawsuit, in your complaint? And then what did you get in your settlement agreement, if anything, or in jury, or et cetera. And so the tax court, first of all, the IRS says, "Hey, mental anguish, that's taxable." Her accountant keeps telling her it's not taxable. It's right. So they goes to the U.S. tax court, which again, pretty universal across the United States. This is not like, oh, just applies to California. So the court raises the issue and says, look, as a general rule, settlement proceeds are not considered to be income as long as they're paid as a result of personal injuries or personal sickness. Now, there is an IRS rule, which is why I wonder why the accountant got it wrong. There is a rule that says, and it's section 104A, that says emotional distress shall not be treated as a physical injury or physical sickness. So it's taxable. So I'm not totally sure why this was confusing here, but the tax court very much credits the woman and says, listen, you're not going to have to pay back pay or back wages or back taxes on your anything, on your settlement. And even says, look, we get your accountant being wrong. We understand it's confusing. But the court says mental injuries, right, are not physical injuries and they are taxable. Now, so that's the whole holding, but there's some interesting parts to this because I have some questions, right? The court says emotional distress is not personal injury. So if there are, and I'm quoting this phrase from other stuff, physical manifestations of an emotional injury, is that, I question, taxable, right? So here she said, let's keep this narrow. She suffered from emotional distress, embarrassment, and humiliation. They don't talk about, and it says there's no allegations of physical disease or harm in her complaint. So she isn't claiming physical manifestations. I believe if you went through therapy and you're having nightmares and terror and PTSD, that would probably not be taxable, but embarrassment is taxable, right? You need physical manifestations. Now that's a guess because that's always been my belief of the rule. This is making clear the rule only or does not apply to when there are none.
Let's go to the other extreme. What types of harm would be subject to not being taxable. Okay, so let's say somebody breaks their leg. Somebody gets pushed down and they break their leg.
Not taxable.
Well, obviously, there's no financial connection with the breaking of a bone. Okay, what you have is pain and suffering. So, and to your point, I'm trying to agree with you. How do you tease out the difference between the pain that you feel from a broken bone, which is not taxable,
right,
from the emotional distress? In this case, it was a sexual harassment case. How do you tease out the difference between the pain and suffering you feel from a broken bone versus the pain and suffering you feel from the trauma of the sexual harassment?
Yeah, and the phrase people use, I didn't make it up, is physical manifestations of an emotional injury.
And that's where things like insomnia,
yes,
rapid heart rate, other types of panic
flashbacks,
attacks,
fear,
and all of
right,
those things.
physical
So
fear.
I see where you're going with this, and it is sort of an uncomfortable sort of line that the court or the tax court or the IRS is trying to draw here, and I don't know if it's workable, because really, how would you quantify the pain from a broken leg? You can, I mean, obviously the lost wages and medical bills and all that, fine. You can quantify that, okay? But how do you quantify the pain and suffering from a broken leg? And how do you distinguish that
from emotional pain?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's sort of artificial.
Yeah, but I think the court wasn't so wrong, because what they focus on, like embarrassment, for example, right? And look, this is, and I'm not knocking the attorney, this is a pleading error and a settlement drafting error, because neither cares. The side
I thought they did a good job with the drafting.
Care.
I thought that the drafting was, and the court said it, the drafting of the language in the settlement was adequate. It's
but
just
not
that
enough to get
didn't
passed.
align, right? It didn't align with what the allegations in the complaint were. Right. And I see what you're saying, the drafting error in the complaint. Yeah.
Yep. They should have, again, they should have used the phrase physical manifestations that, if it's true, that normally gets you past it. And look, when you settle, here's the part attorneys got to realize, right? And look, I do a ton of these settlements all the time, so I'm used to this issue, but when you settle, there's no finding of proof. It's almost a stipulation that we agree with, here's your injuries. The defendant doesn't care what you do with your money as long as they don't have to pay their portion of taxes on it, right? Because if they do and you're an employee, they're going to withhold wages, et cetera, right? But here they're just going to give a 1099, all right? It's kind of an independent thing. But when you don't have a jury or an expert finding of here's what your injuries are, you are free to craft this in any way you want. The lawyers just didn't think of it. The lawyers could have crafted this as there were physical manifestations of injury. Now, look, you got to be careful. You don't want to engage in tax fraud if there weren't any, and that could come to tax fraud because you're intentionally, right, trying to get around it. But if she was having bad dreams and was, night terrors and PTSD, that's a better way than just claiming emotional distress. But look, in complaints, that's always what we do. General, right, emotional distress and blah, blah, blah. It's just general stuff. You don't usually have to in a complaint. Now, one of these things that's interesting is, this is getting very technical in procedure. When somebody serves a complaint, files a lawsuit, then the other side serves or files an answer, a response denying or agreeing. And then what the defendant always sends to the plaintiff is what's called a demand for a bill of particulars, at least in New York. There's other phrases, but basically it's a document that says, you said emotional injuries, tell me exactly what those emotional injuries are. That wasn't put before the court. And I'm assuming, therefore, because they didn't put that before the court as a more specific description, that there weren't anything more than humiliation and embarrassment. So I'm going to credit the court with saying, look, this is just humiliation and embarrassment. There's no physical manifestations. That's taxable. And what this is a lesson to every attorney who does these things to make sure that you properly and truthfully, right, state what the injuries are. And if there are physical manifestations, you got to state it so that it's not taxable. And this is a big deal because I don't know what her income is, but this is a big deal. And this is, almost $400,000. I always say a third of it goes to the state and federal government. That's loss of $100,000.
I would think at least, yeah.
Yeah, at least, absolutely. But very interesting. And that's why I said this is a very interesting case for me, only because I draft these settlements all the time. As somebody who handles discrimination on both sides of the fence, these are important. These are important.